All right, Ben Rains, thanks again for doing this. We were talking before that when you first saw this place, your immediate thought was we gotta get scientists here.
Yeah, because I'd been diving enough in the Gulf to know I'd never seen trees on the bottom before, and I could distinctly tell immediately they were cypress trees because of the cypress tree has a very distinct shape, what they call the buttresses, those big irregular lumps that come out, and then the knees all around it. And the stumps out there had knees all the way around them. So immediately I knew they were cypress trees. I knew they were 60 feet underwater in the Gulf of Mexico, and you could see a river channel that wove through the spot. Like you're swimming over tree stumps, and then the stumps stop, and there's a ledge, and you swim out over the ledge, and what you're swimming across is an ancient river, and then the trees start up again on the other side. And I could see all that in my first visit, so I realized I am looking at an island in an ancient river delta. And of course, we're 10 miles south of Gulf Shores at this point. So we're, 30 miles from the Mobile-Tensaw Delta up here where we are now. And this is what that forest would have looked like. It had the same trees, for the most part, that we have now, cypress trees and oak trees and things. It's actually a little bit different composition, though, than a modern Gulf Coast cypress forest because it was much colder back then. So this forest has been dated now to 70,000 years ago, which is in the middle of the Ice Age. And so that's why the sea levels were so much lower. There was so much water frozen, locked up in the glaciers. So that forest back there, we've learned from doing sediment cores that LSU did, looking at the seed and pollen that they're finding. To find a forest today with the same makeup of trees and grasses, you have to go to Virginia, to coastal Virginia, because a place where it snows and it freezes and there's ice. So taking that a step further down here, back then, sea levels would have been hundreds of feet lower. Dauphin Island and Fort Morgan would have actually been mountains towering over the landscape. And they sometimes would have been snow-capped mountains because it would have been snowing on them. It's just
So basically, I mean, a climate like Virginia, you say that now.
Yes. So in Virginia, you get a lot of snow, a lot of ice and all that. And that's what this place would have been like. It was warm enough still down here that the glaciers didn't come all the way down here. So they petered out in about Tennessee. And so this part of Alabama actually was a climate refuge for a lot of these plants. So after the frost retreated, after the Ice Age ended, the plants climbed up along these river systems, along the Alabama river systems, and into the Appalachian Mountains and repopulated the Appalachian Mountains with all these plants from down here.
And so 70,000 years ago, I mean, this would have been many, many thousands of years before there were any people, right? Before people came down across Bering Strait.
Absolutely. And because of that, the stumps out there are huge. Many of them are 10 feet across. This is a redwood-sized tree. So these trees would have had a circumference of 30 feet. So if you can imagine this ancient landscape, and that's what this delta looked like when they started cutting the trees down in the 1800s. They were cutting down redwood-sized trees, if you look at some of the old pictures. I take people on my trips. We hike into the last of the big cypress up in the north part of the delta. And that tree is about 700 years old, and it's 32 feet around. So you can get a window into what these forests looked like back then. It's hard to remember Alabama didn't always look like it looks today. It looks like it looks today because of what we've done to it. And a lot of what we've done to it is cut things down, to make fields or to use the wood for things. And so, the ancient landscape here would have been this landscape of gigantic trees.
That's interesting. So, and these trees now, they're alive still? I mean, is this a living forest or
Oh, no. These trees are long dead. They actually were submerged very quickly, from what we can gather. So they were still growing as mud flooded in from the north. As the glaciers melted, huge flows of mud came down all across the continent. And the thought is they just swallowed these trees up and covered them up in place. And so that acted almost as a time capsule. If you go out there, when we bring wood up for the scientists and we cut it on the deck of the boat with a saw, you smell that fresh, piney scent of fresh cut cypress, and you can actually see sap ooze out of the wood. So this is 70,000-year-old sap. Now what that tells us is that the wood it's not petrified.
That's what I was going to ask. So it's not petrified.
It's not petrified. It's not a fossil. These are trees that were covered in sediment. So in the marine environment, any aquatic environment, when you get about 6 inches of sand or mud on top of something, there's no rot because there's no oxygen. And so these trees never rotted. So they're still intact. You can cut them with a saw. You can do things with the wood. That's kind of what led to the whole protection. As soon as I wrote the first story about it, for back when Mobile had a newspaper, I got calls from furniture companies wanting to buy the coordinates from me. One company actually offered me $10,000 because they wanted to go down and pull the stumps up and make things out of them, furniture and things like that. And that's actually the push that finally got the bill into Congress.
And that's what Jerry Carl was telling us, that they want to turn it into furniture, which kind of surprised me because it seems like there'd be simpler, cheaper ways to get wood than to dive down 60 feet.
You got to think about, you got to expand your idea of what furniture is. So imagine you're making a Fender Stratocaster guitar that people already pay thousands for, and then imagine it's made out of 70,000-year-old wood. And so then you got a guitar that's going to sell for tens of thousands of dollars. Yeah. Same thing with a coffee table, a bowl, anything. And they wanted to exploit it like that. To me, what we have offshore is, it's like Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. It's a natural wonder. There's nowhere else on the planet you can go see trees 70,000 years old, still rooted in the mud they were growing in. And so it needs to be preserved like that, like Yellowstone or like the Grand Canyon, somewhere people can go and see. Because essentially, it's like swimming with dinosaurs. You know, it's this bizarre fairy landscape with incredible amounts of life, and then these tree stumps everywhere. And so the idea that we would pull them up to make coffee tables or something like that, to me, is just absurd. You know, if you want a tool to teach people about climate change, the underwater forest is that tool. There is no more graphic way to show people that water levels change, that sea levels change, that glaciers come and go, than to go out there 60 feet underwater and see trees that were once on dry ground. And this is what that forest would have looked like. You know, and so that's just a really unique thing. For Alabama, this is a huge boon. This is a tourism draw unlike anything else on Earth. And it's going to bring dive people in. You know, people pay billions of dollars a year to go diving all over the world. Well, you know, our Gulf of Mexico, the water is a little murky sometimes. We don't have coral reefs up in this part, but we have this. And this is every bit as fascinating and compelling as a coral reef. It's just an incredibly unique site.
So I mean, how well can you see it down there? I mean, with the water?
Well, it all depends. So the Gulf of Mexico visibility can change during a dive while you're underwater. It can go from clear and you can see people 50 feet away to you can't see the guy 3 feet away from you sometimes. If you watch the Underwater Forest documentary, you'll see some very clear days. And I think the clearest day we had was in December. But there were plenty of times I've been out there. In fact, this time of year, when you get into July, August, September, October, that's typically some of our clearest time of the year because the rivers are at their lowest flow. And it's very clear out there right now. I've been out there on an October day when you could look, standing on the boat, you could look over the side and see the stumps on the bottom. So sometimes we have really clear water. But it's always, you know, kind of a crapshoot in the Gulf of Mexico. If you go diving in the Gulf, you should be ready not to be able to see anything at any point.
And so this is federal water, right? It's 10
Yes.
miles out.
Yeah.
So, I mean, would the federal government already have to give permission to a company to harvest something like that? I mean, you couldn't legally just go take it, right?
So the furniture companies, I think it was in about 2000, maybe 18, they applied for the permits, maybe 2020. They applied to the Corps of Engineers in the state of Alabama. Now, they didn't really need the state of Alabama permit, I don't think, because it is in federal waters. But that's what they were trying to go through the Corps of Engineers. And it's federal waters, and currently there are no laws that would prohibit someone from taking wood from the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. The trick with the forest is nobody knows where it is, and that's how we've been able to protect it all this time. So part of the bill, if you know, we now have the bill in the Senate thanks to Senator Tuberville, and we had the bill through the House thanks to House Rep. Carl. Those bills are designed to reveal the location once the protections are in place. And so the public will be able to go there and access the site.
So, I mean, I guess it's just, it's one, an extra layer of protection, but then also unlocking this tourism opportunity.
The tourism thing and the research possibilities. So if it becomes a national marine sanctuary, which protects the wood, that also unlocks National Marine Sanctuary research funding, which Alabama can't access right now because the only Gulf of Mexico marine sanctuaries, one's in the Florida Keys and one is in a place called the Flower Garden Banks off Texas, which is 100 miles offshore. And you got to go to Galveston and then take a boat overnight to get out there. So there's no research being done there, certainly by Alabama scientists. But here, with the 22 schools that make up the Dauphin Island Sea Lab Consortium, and you know, University of South Alabama, Auburn, Alabama, all of these schools would suddenly have access to this huge pot of federal money that's sitting in the NOAA funding every year for research at these national marine sanctuaries. So our universities and the Dauphin Island Sea Lab would suddenly be able to get into this huge pot of money and do all kind of climate science out there with the trees. The trees themselves are a climate capsule, just the wood. They can tell things about the composition of the atmosphere, how much CO2 was in it. They can tell things about temperature changes. They can tell things about how cold the winter was, just looking at the growth rates and all these things. There's so much science yet to be done. There have been a few funded studies out there, but all the original science was actually funded. I was running the Weeks Bay Foundation, and I got the Gulf Shores Tourism Office gave us $5,000, and the CCA gave us $3,000, and that's how we brought all the scientists out for the original science, was those two pots of money.
And when you're diving down there, I guess you must feel like you're going through some sort of time portal.
You do feel like you're going through some sort of time portal, and it's so alien to see trees underwater. That's its whole that's a whole component of it all by itself, being unusual. But the trees are covered in sea anemones. They're octopus, they're eels, they're crabs, all poking out from these trees. We see sea turtles out there all the time. If you watch the documentary, you'll see a moment where there's a guy who has a shark pop up right by his ear. That's me. So there's sharks out there. It's for anybody who's ever been scuba diving, it will be one of the most unique diving experiences you ever have. For people who haven't been diving, I've seen it make people get certified so that when it's open, they get to go.
So, a national park or something on land, you can put a fence around it, and you can have park rangers. How do you protect something like that, from poachers?
Well, so I'm not worried about somebody taking a tiny little piece of wood. I'm worried about somebody taking a stump that weighs 2,000 pounds. And so to do that, to get it out of the water, they'll have to be out there in some kind of workboat with a big A-frame winch on the back. People are going to be able to see that from shore. People are going to see that. The fishermen are going to see that. Nobody's going to be able to go out there and harvest these stumps without being noticed due to its location. It's only 10 miles out, and you can see 15 miles out from shore. So, once it's protected, it's protected. People are going to be the guards. It's not like a park where you have to protect it. You don't have to empty the garbage can. This is not something that's going to cost Alabama or the federal government money to preserve. It's just going to bring money in.
And how big is it?
Well, the main site, the original site we found, is about a half mile square. We've since found other locations with a few outcrops, and we plan to release those locations too. And there, you see trees just like at the original site. LSU, we did a lot of work with sonar equipment, and they actually discovered what the forest looks like when it's still buried. And so we found big areas where we have more forest underwater, under 9 feet of sand. And so as that gets exposed, then fresh logs will be exposed. It's really interesting that you don't have forest preserve like this elsewhere in the world. And the reason is that glacial melt. That's what preserved these trees. When that big wall of mud came down and flooded over the landscape and covered the trees, that was what saved them. And that's why you see that here, but you don't see it in other places.
How fast would that have happened?
Well, that's a really interesting thing. They're thinking that it must have happened in weeks to months.
So weeks to months?
Very quickly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I always think about this as like a glacial pace, right?
Like hundreds or thousands of years.
So tipping points in the climate record are really interesting, and the period when this was going on was a really, things were changing very quickly, and temperatures were swinging wildly. The early estimates for sea level rise for this century we're in were 6 feet. Well, back then when the forest got covered, they were seeing 10 feet in 100 years. And I think we're on the way to that here. I'm seeing sea level rise very quickly. We know that the Gulf Coast, right where we are, is one of the fastest rising spots on the planet, and that's due to multiple things about our location and the fact that the water's hot and is expanding and all that. But, for people who live around Mobile, drive across the causeway on a high tide day. I drove across that thing every day for 15 years going to the newsroom. And the causeway, the parking lot at Ralph and Keiko's was never underwater unless we were having a tropical storm. Now it goes underwater multiple days a month just on a high tide. That's the most graphic display I can give people who live here.
And so...
that's a good point, yeah. Very good point.
If this bill passes, does anything have to happen, or just it's declared now and it just takes effect, and there's, and as you said, there's not really infrastructure that gets like built up around it. I mean, it just becomes law.
Yeah, and I suspect that the day the location is released, we'll probably have a bunch of boats out there and a bunch of people trying to dive on it, and it'll be an event, and it'll be a lot of fun.
And if it's
how deep is the water there?
60 feet.
60 feet. Okay.
Yeah, so the forest is 60 feet underwater, which is an easy dive for recreational divers. That is a very shallow depth, and there are not a lot of other things around here that are that shallow to dive on. And so that's a safe dive. Families can comfortably do that.
And so 60 feet under, 10 miles out, 70,000 years is when it dates to, and at what point would it have been covered?
Oh, it was covered 70,000 years ago.
70,000. So it actually dates back further than, I guess, right?
Well, yeah. So the trees, some of the trees are hundreds of years old. And some of them may have been pushing 1,000 years old. But when they had to get covered very quickly to be preserved the way they're preserved.
And so now, and you said they stayed preserved because they were under mud and there was no. But now, since the hurricane, they're exposed. I mean, do they deteriorate now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen numerous stumps and logs exposed that weren't exposed by different storms that have come through. And so they go through a cycle. When they're first exposed, nothing grows on them. They're very hard. When a stump is first exposed, or a tree, you can actually see the bark still on it. You can peel the bark off the tree. That's how fresh they are. Over time, anemones will start growing on them, and barnacles and things like that. You'll see little oysters in the nooks and crannies, and then you'll start seeing worms boring holes in them as they get softer. So cypress is one of the most rot-resistant woods on Earth. That's why we built so many things out of it. And that's why these trees have lasted so long after being exposed. There's stumps out there that I first saw in 2011 that are still intact and still there. The outer layer is getting softer. You can pull it apart with your hands. But the stumps that are newly exposed are rock hard, and it's a dynamic spot. Being so shallow, when a hurricane comes through, for every foot a wave is above the surface, it reaches down 10 feet underwater. And so, Hurricane Ivan, we had 98-foot waves. So this spot was getting scoured. And so whenever we have a big storm like that, a lot happens down there. And I've seen big changes. But the site has never gotten covered. More gets uncovered. Now that could change someday, but as I mentioned, there are other spots as well. So once it's protected, I think it will be open to the public for a long, long time.